There's a story that most of us have been told, or maybe just absorbed over time. We're definitely familiar with it. That when people are left on their own, when all structure disappears, when there's no one in charge, that things will fall apart. It shows up in books and movies, in the stories that seem to stick in our psyche. Groups turn on each other, fear takes over, order doesn't last very long. And maybe that feels true, because we've heard it so many times. But every now and then, something happens that doesn't follow that pattern at all. Something much easier to overlook. Not because it isn't remarkable, but because nothing went wrong. Tonight, on the Midnight Drive, we're getting into a real story of survival, and the strange reason you've probably never heard it. There's a version of this story that most of us expect. A group of young people, no adults, no rules, no structure. An island, isolation, and the slow unraveling that follows thereafter. That's the version we've seen before. But this one didn't happen that way. In 1965, 6 teenage boys from Tonga made a decision that probably didn't feel very serious at the time. They were students at a boarding school, restless, curious, looking for something different. So they took a boat. Not carefully planned, not fully thought through. They borrowed it, really. The idea was simple. Leave! Go somewhere else. Maybe find something better. But that first night, everything changed. A storm came in. Not gradually, not something they could adjust to. It tore through the boat. It destroyed the sail. It took the rudder. And suddenly they weren't traveling anymore. They were drifting. For 8 days, they stayed out there. No real food, no reliable source of water, just the ocean, moving them wherever it wanted. At that point, survival isn't a strategy. It's just endurance. And eventually they saw land, a small, remote island called ʻAta. Uninhabited, rocky, isolated, very easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. They made it to shore. And for just a moment, that could have been the end of the story. Stranded, no way out, no one's coming. But instead of breaking down, something else happened. On that first day, they made a decision. Not out of panic, not out of desperation, but intentionally. They made a pact. No fighting. If something went wrong, they would talk it through. They'd resolve it. They'd move forward. That decision matters more than anything else that came after, because it set the tone, not just for survival, but for how they were going to exist together. They organized themselves quickly, not with rigid control, but with structure. They worked in pairs, each pair responsible for different tasks. Food, water, shelter. They found ways to collect rainwater, hollowed out tree trunks to store it. When food was scarce, they adapted. Fishing, catching seabirds, using what the island offered without wasting it. At one point, they discovered remnants of an old settlement, an abandoned place that had once supported life. From that, they were able to rebuild something, small but functional. They planted a garden, simple crops, enough to sustain them. Captain Peter Warner, the man who eventually found them, later described it as kind of a miniature civilization. And that's exactly what it was. Not perfect, not easy, but stable. There was one thing they never let go out. Fire. They started it early on, and they kept it alive for over a year. Through weather, through exhaustion, through everything else they were dealing with. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. It requires attention, responsibility, trust that someone else will take over when it's your turn to rest. They also created a space for something else, not just survival, but emotional balance. At night, they would sit together, talk through problems. If someone was frustrated, they didn't let it build. They addressed it, apologized, moved on. One of the boys later described it very simply. If someone got too angry, they would step away, sit alone, look at the ocean until things settled down, and then they came back. That's not something most people expect from a group of teenagers in this situation. But it worked. Because it prevented small problems from turning into something bigger. They found ways to keep their spirits up, too. They made music. A makeshift guitar. Songs they created together. Something to break the repetition. Something to remind them they were still people, not just survivors. They exercised. They stayed active. They maintained routines. Not because they had to, but because it gave shape to their time. And time mattered. Because they were there for 15 months. Not days, not weeks. Over a year of living this way. And throughout that time, they didn't turn on each other. They didn't split into factions. They didn't descend into chaos. They stayed together. Eventually, in 1966, something changed. A passing fishing boat noticed something unusual, a patch of green on an otherwise harsh island. A sign that something was growing there, that something didn't quite belong. When the boat got closer, the crew saw movement. The boys, alive, healthy, stronger than anyone expected them to be. When they reached the boat, there was hesitation at first. The crew didn't know who they were. They didn't know if they were dangerous. But the boys spoke, explained, and within minutes, everything shifted. They had been gone long enough that people back home assumed they were dead. Families had already mourned them. Funerals had already taken place. And then, suddenly, they were back. Not just alive, but intact. There's a part of the story that stays with me. Not just what happened, but how I heard about it. I hadn't, not until recently, and that feels weird to me, because this is the kind of story that should be everywhere. 6 teenagers stranded on an island, left on their own for over a year, and instead of falling apart, they built something. They cooperated. They took care of each other. They created structure where there wasn't any. That's not just survival. That's something else. That's something worth paying attention to. But for a long time, the story stayed quiet, tucked away, not widely told, and it raises a simple question. Why? Why does a story like this fade into the background so easily, while others, with very different outcomes, stay at the center? Because this one doesn't have the elements we've been trained to expect. There's no descent. There's no turning point where everything collapses. No moment where people become something else. It's steady. It's consistent. Almost uneventful in the way that it unfolds. And maybe that's the reason. Because nothing went wrong. And if that's true, then it says something about the kinds of stories we tend to hold on to. Not just what happens, but what we choose to remember and what we expect to happen, even when the reality might look very different. What about you? Is this the first time you've ever heard this story? Let me know in the comments below. Feel free to reach out to us with your stories. Leave us a message on the Midnight Drive on our hotline, 402-610-2830. 3-6. Now, there's another version of this story, one that most people recognize almost immediately. A group of boys, an island, no adults, no rules. But this time, everything falls apart. Lord of the Flies was published in 1954, and for a lot of people, it became the default answer to a very specific question. What happens when structure disappears? What happens when no one is in charge? In the story, it starts off simple enough. The boys organize themselves. They create rules, elect a leader, try to maintain some sense of order. But it doesn't last. Fear creeps in. Not from anything real, at least not at first, but from the idea of something. A beast. Something they can't fully see or understand. And once that fear takes hold, things begin to shift. Power changes hands. Reason gets pushed aside. The group splits. And over time, the structure they tried to build collapses into something else. Something much more chaotic, more violent, and more unstable. It's a compelling story, really. It feels believable. Not because we've experienced it ourselves, but because it lines up with something we've come to expect. That without rules, people revert. That something darker takes over. And that idea didn't stay contained in a single book. It spread into movies, into television, into the way that we talk about human nature. Heck, you can see it in modern shows like Yellow Jackets, a group stranded, isolation, and the slow shift towards something more unsettling. Even when those stories are based on real events, they tend to focus on the same elements: the tension, the breakdown, the moments where survival pushes people into decisions they never expected to make. And to be fair, there are real situations where things became extreme. The Donner Party is one of the most well-known. A group of pioneers delayed and trapped in the Sierra Nevada during winter. Food ran out. Conditions deteriorated. And eventually, some of the group resorted to eating the dead in order to survive. It's a difficult story, not because it's complicated, but because it forces you to sit with what people are capable of under extreme pressure. The same thing shows up in the story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. A plane crashes in the Andes. Survivors stranded in freezing conditions. No food, no immediate rescue, and after days turned into weeks, they made a difficult decision. Not impulsively, and not without hesitation, but out of necessity. They used the bodies of those who had already died to stay alive. Those stories stay with people. They get retold, revisited, reinterpreted, and often they get reduced to a single detail: the most shocking part. The part that feels the hardest to look at. That's what people want to talk about, even though in both of those cases there was more happening. Leadership, cooperation, difficult conversations, and decisions made together. In the Andes, survivors even made a pact. If they died, their bodies could be used to help the others live. That's not chaos, that's structure, even in extreme conditions. But that's not usually the part people focus on. It's the other detail that takes over. The one that lingers, the one that gets repeated. And that pattern shows up in other places too. In media coverage. In the way that stories are framed. During the Ocean Gate submersible incident, there was a moment where experts had already reached a likely conclusion. That survival wasn't possible. But instead of presenting that clearly, we talked about this on a recent episode. Instead of presenting that clearly, coverage focused on a countdown, a literal death clock. how much oxygen was left. Not because it added any kind of clarity, but because it held people's attention. People watched. They followed along. They checked updates. Not knowing exactly what would happen, but feeling like they were watching something unfold in real time. They fixated on the narrative rather than the reality. There's something about that, not necessarily malicious, but it's very revealing. A tendency to focus on the most intense version of a story. The version that creates the strongest reaction. The one that's hardest to look away from. And over time, those versions start to feel like the default. Like the most accurate reflection of what people are like. And when things get difficult enough, something breaks. And everything else follows. But then you have the other story. 6 boys, same conditions, in a way. Isolation. No authority. No external structure. And they didn't follow that pattern. They didn't become what we've been told to expect. So now there are 2 versions sitting next to each other. One we recognize immediately, and one most people have never heard of. Not because it didn't happen, but because it didn't fit the narrative that we've become familiar with. And that raises a different kind of question. It's not about survival, not about extremes, but about attention. About what we choose to hold on to. What gets repeated? What gets amplified? Because it's not just about what people are capable of. It's about which version of that capability we choose to focus on. Maybe the darker stories stay with us because they feel more urgent. They're more dramatic. They're more aligned with the idea that things are always closer to breaking than we think. But the quieter ones, on the other hand, the quieter ones where people cooperate, where structure holds, where nothing collapses. Those don't always travel as far. They don't get told as often. And over time, that imbalance shapes expectation. Not through direct instruction, but through repetition, through exposure, through the kinds of stories that continue to show up. So when we imagine a group of people left on their own, we don't start from a neutral point. We start from a script, one that we've seen before, one that feels familiar. But it's not the only one. It's just the one that we hear the most. And somewhere in the background, there's another version. It's quieter. It's less dramatic. But it is just as real. Consider this. 6 boys. Shipwrecked. Or boat wrecked, I suppose. An island. No rules. No one in charge. And absolutely nothing fell apart.